here. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to Design Charrette number 5 for the Leggett Math and Science Building here at Montgomery College. The team from Link Public Strategies and the Smith Group have some really exciting refinements on designs that they want to share with you tonight. So I look forward to a very interesting presentation. Then we'll have some group stuff again. And hopefully we'll end the evening on a high note with understanding a lot about what Montgomery College needs to do to balance the needs of the academic program, the needs of the neighbors and the community with fiscal prudence, and we'll all achieve a great result. Just a shout out for a minute. I have 3 folks here from Park and Planning. I have Laura, I have Katie, and you got to help me with the third one. Tina, who are here tonight. Other VIPs in the room include County Council member Hans Reamer, is right there. City Council member from Takoma Park, Peter Kovar. And I understand that the mayor will be a little bit late tonight, but that she plans to attend as well. As always, everything that we do in these charrettes is captured on video, and then we keep track of every question and piece of feedback that you give us, and we keep track of that on this website that you can go to as well. So all the presentations we've made will be up there, so everything's there. So now I'm pleased to introduce my partners in crime one more time. Michael Aitken from Link Public Strategies, Bob Bull from the Smith Group. Gentlemen, it's all yours.
Thank you. I feel after this long together, we should be aging these pictures in every presentation and showing the new gray hair that we have. We're excited to be back. I think we've got a really good rhythm coming together. So let us talk about tonight's agenda. It's exactly the same as the last 4 meetings because that format has worked for us. We'll spend some time together in a large group. We'll break out in work groups. We'll come back together and report out. But because this is our last meeting before mandatory referral, we will come back together and also talk about next steps. So please hang around till the end of the meeting if that fits in your schedule. First things first, thank you. And I want to take a moment on this. When we all started this process together, there were a number of commitments that had been made, a number of things that had to be accomplished, and a commitment to a public strategy that was transparent and open, but would only work if all of us came together and kind of trusted that we could get there. I do a lot of public meetings around the country, and I think where this one has gone and how it has evolved, thanks mostly to you coming back every time and telling us what we need to do, architects who are willing and able to turn around some pretty remarkable, quick new renditions between meetings, and a college that really committed to that open transparency. This has been a great process, so I want to thank you all for that. We've come a tremendous way together. This has been a very iterative design charrette process. Between every meeting, there have been absolutely real changes to the project. You can see up here the 5 different meetings that we've had so far, what they look like, the breakout groups, etc. There's been a lot of work done. We said at the beginning of this process that it would be iterative. What that meant is we came to you with things that weren't fully fleshed out. We actually came to you much earlier in the process than architects and planners are generally comfortable. And we did that in the spirit of knowing that we could show you some stuff that wasn't ready and we would work that out together. We are in the 5th meeting, so series number 4, October 16th. We're almost there. The designs that come out of tonight will then be going to mandatory referral, and then we will come back together in the winter after that, after we get feedback from that process, and have one more meeting to continue the iterative design process. So, lots and lots and lots of feedback. You can actually see it up here. I think we should stop and read every one of these before we go further. We got over 500 pieces of individual feedback, questions, comments, concerns, opportunities. Committed to putting all of those up online. They're also posted out in the hallway and responding to each and every one of those. So that all lives online, and I can tell you, because we were in the meetings where this was happening, the architects and the planners looked at each piece of feedback and used that in every design that went forward. So truly needed your feedback. You could see in each of the meetings we came together where we would hear often just one person ask a question, and Bob would spend some time in his next meeting adding a slide at that, which allowed us to get to the 130 slide decks that you saw to make sure every single piece of feedback was listened to. Multiple design studies. This is just a little reminder for those of you who've been here from the beginning and some of those who haven't. This is kind of where we started. You remember charrette number 1, we came together and tried to get some initial guidance for the architects. Charrette number 2, we started looking at 3 different test options and different concepts. We then refined them and refined them and refined them. And tonight you're going to see the next iteration taking all of the feedback that we've gotten so far. The other thing that was really interesting, and I give the architects full credit for this, each time we had a request for what would it look like from my house, what would it look like from my faculty office, what would it look like with this tree or without this tree, or that tree's not the right height, it should be a little bit to the left. We went back and rendered all of those out. This is a tremendous amount of rendering for a project like this, and hopefully it's helped all of us get a much better understanding of what the actual sightline impacts are from virtually every angle of this building. And then the last thing that I want to mention is this was not an insignificant challenge. The goal was to get a building that balanced the needs of a very residential community, faculty and staff who needed very specific things out of a building like this, and then the fiscal requirements that are on a building like this. It's a pretty challenging set of things to do in one building in this time frame, and I think together we've made a lot of progress on that. So I will now turn this over to Bob to walk us through what is another very significant slide deck. We have 110 slides tonight. I say that because we're going to get into really granular detail. We're going to move it really quickly. If you have questions, we will take them, but we also are going to break into work groups where we can have those discussions, so we're going to try and keep that moving along. Sound good? Bob?
Thanks, Michael. So the good news is we're on slide 19 already. Hopefully we'll move quickly. We did get some feedback after the last presentation to go back and reiterate how this project is going to relate to circulation around the new building and on campus. So we just want to go back. This is a slide we showed in an earlier presentation about how the new building, the project site here in blue, is going to be impacted by pedestrian and vehicular circulation. So I'll point out first the pedestrian circulation. All the little light red lines with arrows are basically the paths people would take to get to the building, and you can reverse each one of those, basically imply how they would get out of the building. The one thing to keep in mind with this campus is really unique is that there's a head end to the campus, and it's basically the Nunley Center. That's where most people come and go from campus. All the parking is in the east garage, which is further north from there. All the metro or the ride-on buses stop in this general vicinity. So anybody that would be coming from metro would either be walking from the Silver Spring Metro to here or taking a ride-on bus. There may be an occasional few people that might walk in from the south, but the vast majority of all the people that come to the campus come from the north end. So from that head end, you see a variety of different pathways and paths that meander between the buildings, but predominantly through the center of campus to our project site. So that is the way we've oriented the building, its entries and its exits, to take advantage of that existing pattern of circulation. The other thing that was asked was how does vehicular access work around the site? And what we're proposing is a very little amount of change to the existing pattern of vehicular access to the campus, and especially as it relates to our project. So what you're seeing here in the white arrows is essentially a new drop-off configuration. Currently there are 2 curb cuts. There's one off of Fenton, and there's one off of Takoma. We are suggesting adding a second curb cut off of Fenton that would allow for a vehicular drop-off function in this general vicinity that would keep most of the traffic associated with that activity out of the neighborhood. There is an exit still that's currently in existence and functioning out on Takoma Avenue. We're currently suggesting to keep that exit out of the parking area onto Takoma Avenue to minimize the sort of access or the sort of turnaround radius needed in the center of this parking area. So it basically minimizes the amount of paving required for the parking spaces that are provided on campus. So with that, we'll move on to some of the design iterations and some of the recap from the last presentation. We'll summarize again what the original directives were, what we started with from the very beginning. Basically, we've summarized these a few times before, but essentially maintaining a setback off of Takoma Avenue and aligning with the current setback at Falcon Hall, protecting the park-like atmosphere or greenery on the corner of Fenton and Takoma, minimizing windows along Takoma Avenue, which is essentially this facade here, ensure the height is no more than 2 stories along Takoma Avenue, and that is essentially in this red hashed zone, which is an additional 70 feet from the existing 110 feet setback from the existing Falcon Hall. Take advantage of the topography to minimize the perceived height. The existing building site slopes 10 feet from Fenton to the center of campus, So this is suggesting burying portions of the building to minimize the perceived height within the neighborhood. Locate the height and rooftop units away from Takoma Avenue. So essentially suggesting that most of the mechanical equipment that will support the building will be housed on the roof, will be organized on the north end of the site, preferably along Fenton Street. And maximizing the building width and lowering the height. The area you see rendered here in blue between these dashed lines is essentially the building limit line. It's the area where we could conceivably build the building. And so this is suggesting to use as much of that footprint as possible and keep the building as low as possible. It's a simple geometric exercise. And the last one is to hire an architect like us. So just to reiterate again, another very important fact is that we are building and designing a brand new science and math building. The conventions for those types of buildings have changed dramatically over the last few years. We're building a building that looks like this, not some of the older buildings that you may recognize from 20 years ago. This is not a type, very functional lab facility, but it's a place for people to engage and learn about science and math, not only from professors, but from each other, to build a community around the academic functions that support the program. It's a unique development in this particular realm of higher education. We're going to be using these models to help structure the building and configure the spaces. Also a reminder that this will be a LEED certified building. It's required that we meet at least LEED Silver. So there's a series of sustainability goals that we will be imbuing into the project over the course of the months ahead. We have touched on some of these through the course of some of the presentations we've already given, but this will be predominantly a topic for discussion in later phases of the design when we start talking about real specifics about how the mechanical system is designed, how the materials are selected, and how energy is going to be used within the building. And again, a refresher on what is in the building. This is a diagrammatic representation of all the spaces that currently comprise the program. The small blue boxes are offices. The large yellow and orange rectangles are laboratories or classrooms. And the purple space is basically academic support. So very quickly you can see just from this diagram that a large portion of this space is going to be a laboratory function. All right, so the last time we presented a unique sort of diagram that showed the building as it relates to the surrounding context and what is driving some of the massing configurations that we were presenting. And this summarizes that original series of diagrams that represents basically by this blue rectangle what is essentially a pattern of very large buildings that are longer, stretched out along Fenton Street, that are consistent with Nunley and Science North, that are a little different than what you would expect in a residential context. When you turn the corner on Takoma and New York Avenue, you have the Resource Center and the Commons Building. They tend to be a little lower, they tend to be a little more squat, and they have a different relationship to the campus itself, in that they're more presentable, they have smaller facades, and they have a more granular scale. So the site of our project is actually at the confluence of those two things. So we are designing a building that's trying to assimilate both of those contextual geometric relationships in the surrounding community. We also talked last time about the materiality for the new building. We've done a survey of the existing campus and some of the neighborhood influences that we think are pertinent to how a new building might be rendered and what materials would be used. Generally, there's a very neutral earth tone quality to the existing campus. What we're suggesting is we would present a very similar palette for the new building. It's important to note that we are at a very early stage of the design, that there will be other future discussions about specific material selections. So what we're really looking at here is just a general tonality of the coloring of the materials and what certain aspects of the materials that may be specific for specific uses. So we're looking at natural brick colors that can be found on campus currently, clay precast tiles that are evident on some of the buildings currently across the street from the existing campus and on campus, some small amounts of potential wood, glass curtain wall, sloped metal roofing, and the native landscape and sort of green aesthetic that is very prominent in the residential community, and how that might be brought into the our end of the campus to tie it together with the residential community. And what is often evident within a context very similar to this part of Takoma Park, some of the small garden walls, stone walls, and things like that, that really give it a very nice residential quality. Those aspects could be brought into the architecture of the new building, begin to knit those things together and make the building feel like part of the community. So we're going to go way back to July 12th, the first presentation, or Charrette, that we actually shared some design ideas. And the first step we took was to actually take some of the original community feedback and try to manifest that on the site in a massing study, without really saying that it's part of the architecture. But really, this is just sort of a due diligence study. So what happens if we just take the existing Falcon Hall on Science North and just leave that building footprint and build up? And very quickly you see that the building is just radically taller than anything else around it. It doesn't really fit in very well with the context of the residential community. The other suggestion was, what if you take as much of the building mass as possible and push it to the center of campus? And again, we had a very similar reaction to this one, that it was just way too tall. Just the program for the building doesn't function very well when it's stacked up on many floors. There's a sweet spot in a building like this. There's like 3 or 4 floors. Anything more than that, you tend to break up the program too much. The functionality between the different uses breaks down, and it doesn't work effectively. And then we looked at a hybrid approach where you take a little bit of the massing and you put it on the Fenton Street side, but you still have a majority of the mass in the center of campus. And what we found with this scheme was that it was sort of flip-flop. It would predicate that all the labs would have to be on the campus side. And from a solar analysis that we did in the earlier presentation, we learned that we really want the labs to be on the Fenton Street side to optimize its orientation to the solar gain that would be coming from the western and southern approaches. And also to sort of take the more open and academically engaging parts of the program and putting it on the campus side so that it could spill out into that natural courtyard that would be created between the new building and the existing buildings. So for a variety of reasons, these 3 options were not pursued. Then we showed you 3 other options that we thought all worked very well with the program and the distribution. They all had very unique aspects of them between like how the lab bar was configured versus how the building mass may be broken up, and how it might address certain key aspects of the site, like Fenton Street, by taking the building and sort of pushing it along that curve. What we heard from that discussion was that basically the scheme that actually took the building facade and stretched it out along Fenton pushed that building facade too far into the neighborhood. That scheme was then abandoned, and we really focused on scheme 2 and 3 at that point for further development. And then we looked at, on September 11th, which ended up being a very critical point in our presentation process, 2 options. One we called rotated pavilion, the other one distributed bars, to really sort of set up the dialogue for the schemes going forward, and to basically the final scheme that we're going to show you here tonight. Essentially, these 2 schemes had very distinct differences. One of the primary ones was the fact that the distributed bars had 3 stories plus a mechanical penthouse on Fenton Street. We heard very quickly that that was not something that was advantageous or desirable by the community, so we abandoned that concept. But then looked at a hybrid approach where we took the lower building height on Fenton and reduced it to be similar to concept 2, but then used some of the attractive aspects of concept 3 that we heard lots of positive feedback from the community on, which was the breaking down of the scale on Takoma Avenue, the sort of limitation and reduction of the building masses by notches and articulations around the facade on Takoma, and developed this Scheme 2.5 that incorporated what we thought were the positive aspects of both Scheme 2 and Scheme 3. And we moved forward with those 2 at the last presentation. So when we took those 2 September 11th options and developed them for our last meeting, October 2nd, here you can see how those 2 options were developed further for our discussion then. One thing I'll point out is that we got very hung up on the discussion of photovoltaics in the last presentation. We want to make sure it's clearly understood that none of the schemes we're presenting, even then or even tonight, are really contingent on the photovoltaics. We can make the photovoltaics work with almost any scheme that we come up with. We don't want that to be the key driver for any of the decision making for this. It's really about the building mass, the height. Let's get that right first. We can figure out how to do the photovoltaics after that. So you'll see, this is the last time in these images that we're going to be fixated on that particular aspect of the design. We'll bring it back later when we're ready, when we have some of these other key details worked out. So some of the things that you'll see that were different in these two schemes as we presented them in October 2nd was we took a very unique approach to how to organize the mechanical equipment. We centered it on the two laboratory bars and basically took the screen wall that was associated with all of that mechanical equipment and pushed it to the building edge. This was predominantly an efficiency move to make sure that the screen wall and the area contained behind the screen wall was as small as possible. And it basically helped us reduce the bulk of the building along Fenton and actually helped reduce some of the setbacks on Takoma Avenue. So just in summary, before we get into like any of the new options that we're showing tonight, this is a chronology of how the different options have developed from Charrette 2, Charrette 3, and Charrette 4 sort of organized this way, and then how the different options sort of lived through those different iterations. So Concept 2 has had a life from the very beginning until tonight, and then Concept 2.5 took on its existence after Charrette number 3, and then through the Charrette number 4 on October 2nd. And then it has been merged, or we're recommending a sort of unified approach between the two concepts that would be the sort of reconciliation of all the issues we've heard to date between the different options. And the thing that the option, the way we're presenting it tonight on October 16th, what it does do, that it is successful between both options, that it does very specifically is it reduces the mass on Takoma. One of the things we heard very specifically with many of the comments was like minimizing the building appearance on Takoma Avenue and trying to take as much of the building mass and move it to the center of campus as possible. This concept would do that. It does have an articulated planetarium, and that it does stick up out of the building. That has a very relatable scale and proportion to the residential community around it. So we're continuing to push forward with that particular concept. The quad side of the building has a very similar scale to the other buildings around it, so we're going to get into a little more detail specifically on how that works in some of the later images in tonight's presentation. And it does actually work best for the academic programs. We've had a very detailed analysis that's separate from this discussion with the academic stakeholders, and their preferences for the concept and the way this stacks out, that it works the best for them. And this option would, because of the way it's set back, have a reduced amount of windows on Takoma Avenue, which again was one of the primary drivers for the original design projects. So again, taking this option through its evolution, we started out with a Concept 3. It evolved into a Concept 2.5, which had a lower building height on Fenton Street. Then how it looked on October 2nd, where it had the express planetarium, the single story on Takoma, the higher penthouse area in the center bar and the lower penthouse along Fenton. And then some options that we're going to show you tonight, which is a development beyond what we showed last time, really looking at how you could potentially treat the mechanical equipment differently on top of the existing building footprint as presented in option 2.5 on October 2nd. So we're going to go through the typical exercise of sort of building up the plan from the ground up. Nothing has really changed here, but we'll just summarize what is really the sort of underpinnings for the new building. So we're looking at the ground floor. The ground, or the sort of grayish brown line you see back there is essentially a basement wall. So this floor is accessible from the campus side, but on the Fenton Street side, it's 1 story below grade. So this is essentially all below grade with the exception of this facade facing the campus. So we moved up and added 1 story on top of that. Here you can see the lab components stacked on top of each other, and they will continue to do that along the Fenton Street side. You'll see the planetarium poking out from above the single story that is presented along Takoma. And then some of the campus, or the student active spaces along the campus side in the greenhouse. And then consistently stacking the laboratories on top of that, and additional labs on the campus side, moving up to the 3rd floor. And then here's a comparison between how that distributed bars scheme evolved from September 11th onto October 2nd, and how you see the difference in how the mechanical equipment was treated on October 2nd versus how it was treated on September 11th. We heard a lot of feedback about this at the last meeting, and how the setback from the September 11th mechanical treatment was preferred. So we're actually looking at how we can address that same mechanical approach with the proposed scheme. So essentially what you're seeing is everything below the penthouse is the same from the last presentation, but we adopted the September 11th mechanical penthouse organization with a little more detail. We know a little bit more about the particular mechanical equipment that needs to go up there. We can be a little more specific about how the screen wall works, and we've done that due diligence in trying to represent how that might work on the floor or on the roof of the original design from last time. We are also going to show you another alternative, which takes all that mechanical equipment and pushes it over onto Fenton Street. We heard a lot about that. There was a vehement opposition to having the mechanical equipment on the center bar because the sense was that it was presenting itself too closely to the neighborhood. So we looked at an option, well, what would happen if we just put it all on Fenton Street? And that was several of the suggestions we got in the breakout groups was to explore that option. So this does explore that option. We have some high-level views that will show you how that manifests itself. So we'll get into some of this summary. Again, this is the image from September 11th that we showed early in the design process versus what we showed on October 2nd. And you can see there is a difference in the building facade. So we're going back to the September 11th building profile, and we're going to use that as a guide going forward to some of the images we'll show you tonight. So just to refresh everybody's memory, this is the intersection at Takoma and Fenton. This is a very carefully constructed representation of this existing screening of trees. Just to remind everybody that you're really probably not going to see much of the building, but just for our exercise tonight, we're going to remove those trees so that we can have a clearer view of the building that will be behind the trees when it's actually constructed. So again, this is the concept from September 11th. We're going to employ a new tool tonight, which is this red dashed line. So this image will stay consistent on all the images going forward, so you'll be able to easily see a comparison between what was in the September 11th presentation versus what we saw on October 2nd and what we're seeing tonight. So here's that same red line. You can see that profile did not change as we go forward. And here's the concept as it looked on October 2nd. This was the focus of most of our discussion, was the mechanical penthouse as it presented itself into the neighborhood. So here's the first image of what the concept would look like if we took all the mechanical equipment and organized it on the bar that is adjacent to Fenton Street. So you're seeing basically a screen wall that extends from the facade all the way up, and the center bar has no mechanical equipment on it at all. I'll go back one so you can see. Basically, we've taken all of this mechanical equipment and its screen wall and shifted it into that bar. And that is what it would look like. You can see it's, from this vantage point, the building is diminished compared to September 11th, but it is bigger on that.
Bob, question?
Yeah.
Some of us aren't sure what that red line is. Could you just go over that again?
Yeah. So,
not go so
the red.
fast through that. Go back.
Oh, I'm sorry. So the question is, what is the red line?
Yeah.
So this, again, is the rendering as we presented it on September 11th. The red line is the profile of the building as it existed in that concept. We heard very clearly at the last presentation that there was a strong desire for the mechanical configuration on the roof from this concept and how it had a reduced presence within the neighborhood. To help sort of articulate that and compare it to any new schemes that we're seeing tonight, we're using this red line as a guide so you can readily compare the two at one time. So the red line will be consistent. And as you can see, as we click through, the red line does not change. But it shows you the profile of the original concept as compared to the new concepts. Make sense? Okay, so here's where we were. And then the other concept, which is if we take the mechanical penthouse and just set it back from the roof edge, again, a la September 11th, you have a diminished presence from the Takoma Avenue and Fenton Street side. And it doesn't have, it has a diminished presence from Fenton Street. We'll see that in some of the later areas. Another thing that we're going to begin to explore in this presentation is really just the beginning. But later, after we set the building massing, we're really going to be focusing in on material selections. We alluded to that a little bit earlier. But really, after we go through the mandatory referral process is when we're really going to start to look at how would you articulate this building, what specific materials would you pick, and how would you render each one of these building elements to accomplish the sort of aesthetic goals for the project. This is one idea on how that might be accomplished. what we're showing is like an animated brick for a majority of the building facade, potentially some terracotta, as we were saying, is a building element that is used elsewhere on campus. And potentially with the planetarium, thinking about what if we put a living wall around it? Would that help soften its presence within the neighborhood and actually create a more sort of dynamic quality with this sort of framing apart edge of the building around it with this nice green sort of jewel-like element in the middle? So I'll go back, and that would be compared to something that could be more of a stone-like or brick-like edifice, which would have a much different presence. Again, we aren't determining any of that yet. That is for future discussion, but this could be a big part of any of the sort of breakout sessions tonight. If you're so inclined to talk about those elements. There are images on the boards for the breakout sessions tonight that sort of depict these options. So we're now going to go through a series of different views using the same exercises to show you how the building is compared, or the design as we're presenting it tonight compares to that original September 11th configuration. So here you see the September 11th concept versus what we shared on October 2nd. Again, the view from Fenton Street with the trees, and just so that we can talk about the building, we will go south the trees so you can see what's there. The red line again is outlining the profile of the building on September 11th. You can see the building facade and the penthouse are within that red line. This is the concept again that we shared on October 2nd. And again, this was the point of contention for most of the commentary that we got. So here's a new image looking at the concept that we took all the mechanical equipment and located on Fenton Street. And you can see the majority of the building mass as it approaches Takoma and the center of campus is very similar, but as you look at the building mass along Fenton, it's significantly taller. And then this is the option if we set back the penthouse from all the edges and sort of contained it within the middle of the building mass. Again, a la September 11th concept. So again, rotating up along Fenton Street, here we're looking at, again, September 11th on the left, October 2nd on the right. This is the September 11th scheme as it was presented with the red line along the profile, and the red line remains, and this is compared to October 2nd. You can see that that penthouse space was, in this concept, pushed back to the center bar, so you're not seeing it along the building edge on Fenton. And here, if we put all the mechanical equipment on Fenton, here's what the presence would be. You can see it's significantly above the red line that is from September 11th. And then if we did a setback penthouse, what it would look like. And here you're seeing it's very close to what the original concept was from September 11th. Yeah.
Does that setback penthouse only exist on the bar along Fenton, or does it goes into the second bar?
Yeah, it's on both bars. It's essentially exactly the way it was on September 11th, so it straddles both bars. And again, this is a subtle difference, but what we're trying to represent here is that we aren't really committed to a material selection yet for the facade. You see as I'm clicking, it goes from light buff to a grayish brown. We still have a lot of work to do to actually pick specific materials, but if you guys have commentary on that, tonight would be a good night to start that discussion. So again, further up Fenton, further north, the two concepts from September 11th and October 2nd. And again, here's the red line, actually there. Here it was on October 2nd, so again, all the penthouse equipment was pushed to the center of campus. Here it is if you push it all to Fenton Street. And here it is if we almost exactly mirror what was done from September 11th with the setback penthouse from Fenton. And again, just a subtle material change between the two. Okay, now we're going to look at Takoma Avenue and basically the existing access drive, the view from the existing access drive. What we looked at on September 11th, which at this point is looking pretty crude with that big box, but that was the original inspiration for the exposed planetarium. And here's the way it was on October 2nd with the exposed planetarium. And a close-up view with the dashed red line around the profile. And here it is. You can see the big deviation here again, which was the point of contention, but everything else was relatively the same. And where it did deviate the most was in the center of campus, so we didn't get much commentary on that. And then here it is with the option or alternate A, all the mechanical equipment on Fenton. You can barely tell from this vantage point, because it's all hidden behind the center bar of the lab building here. But then if we look at the setback, you can see it just slightly poking out there. So from this vantage point, it doesn't really have much of a difference at all. And then again, the material sort of exercise of what would happen if we tried to soften that with a living wall, which could also be part of the program. There is a portion of the academic program that's housed within this building that is focused on maintaining green roofs and plantings like this. So this could be part of the active sort of engagement part of the program within the building. Okay, so now we're going to move further east of New York. And here's with the trees. You can't see much, but then when you remove the trees, there's that dash red line with the new building poking up above the Commons building. And here it is as it was on October 2nd. You can see it does poke up quite a bit more than the original red line. And then here's alternate A. So this is taking all the mechanical equipment and pushing it towards Fenton. You can barely tell any difference there. And then here it is with the screen wall mirroring September 11th, but centered within the building mass, and you can't see a bit of that screen wall above the Commons. And then very slowly, some material changes there. Okay, so now we'll look at from New York Avenue. September 11th on the left, October 2nd on the right, with the trees, and then without the trees. So here is the building mass as it was presented, and depicted by the red line. From October 2nd, you can see it was very similar. There wasn't much of a change. There was some of that center mechanical equipment poking out around the edges there. But then if we took that, our current scheme, and put all the mechanical equipment along Fenton, there is a pretty evident diminished presence of the building from New York Avenue. And then if you center it, there's a very similar appearance. You really can't see much of that mechanical equipment. You can see a bit of it poking out from that corner. And then just some material changes to talk about how that might be in the future. And then one of the new views that we didn't have last time, but it was asked for, was what is the northern approach? This is basically internally from campus. So as we talked about earlier in the presentation, the predominant pedestrian access to this building is going to be from the Nunley Center walking down towards the center of campus. So this is a view as you would approach from the north along that center corridor. And here's the proposed building mass along that approach. And this again is the September 11th building configuration as it's tucked in there. This is the design as of tonight, so this is not showing the alternate from October 2nd, but essentially what you're seeing is the building mass and a little bit of the penthouse that you can be able to see from there. This essentially would be the front door for people walking in from the north. So again, to reiterate, the majority of the campus circulation and foot traffic would be along this internal corridor, the very convenient entry point from the north side and also from the campus, keeping a lot of that traffic off the external neighborhood circulation pathways and corridors. And then here showing the penthouse. I'm sorry, the last one was the penthouse in Fenton. And here's the penthouse that's centered on both bars, or centered within the building mass. So you can't see a bit of it as you approach from the north. And then in summary, this is basically all the sort of vital rough dimensions for the proposed design as it stands tonight. We're looking at a building that's set back 160 feet from Takoma Avenue, 230 feet from New York Avenue, and you can see all the sort of basic building massing moves here. The ones that are critical to the relationship to the neighborhood are like the 60-foot planetarium width, the 45-foot width of the lab bar, the way we've articulated. And again, those are directly related to trying to fit into a campus context or a neighborhood context with smaller building elements and sort of reduced scales. So the building has a closer, more assimilated relationship to the residential community that's immediately across Takoma Avenue. So, in closing, we'd like to summarize the design directives as we've been summarizing at the beginning of the presentation, but this time we're going to summarize them at the end of the presentation and just talk about what we've achieved versus what we were asked to do at the beginning. So the very first design directive was to keep the current setback of Falcon Hall along Takoma Avenue. So Falcon Hall is currently 110 feet from Takoma Avenue. The proposed design, the closest it gets is 160, so we're already 50 feet further back from the existing Falcon Hall. And then the proposed design actually increases in its setback from Takoma Avenue to 182 and then 264 as you move west along Takoma towards Fenton. Protect the park-like green space along Takoma Avenue and Fenton. So that is this triangular area here. You can see that we have kept any sort of building massing or articulation of architecture away from this area, so the building is set back and preserving that green space as much as possible. We've actually reduced the amount of parking that is occurring in this general area, so it'll actually have more opportunity for green space and planting from that southern approach or southern view. Minimize the windows along Takoma Avenue. Again, this is one of the reasons why we think this option is the most advantageous. The way we've articulated the horizontal base of the building to help reduce the perceived height gives us an opportunity to put in, again, something that or akin to the garden walls within the neighborhood. It does help sort of break down the scale of the building, but also gives us a large unarticulated building mass without windows that doesn't interfere with anything that would be a view from Takoma Avenue. The planetarium does the same thing. It's one of the only programmatic elements within the building that doesn't demand windows. Putting it here on Takoma Avenue really does take advantage of its unique programmatic aspects and how it would relate within the neighborhood. And most of the glazing from this facade is really set back on this 240 feet in this particular part of the building. And we are really using a reduced building or a window profile as it does present itself to the neighborhood on Takoma Avenue by what we're calling punch windows, which are smaller windows, not full expansive glass, but tinier windows within a masonry facade. Again, it's one story along Takoma. I'm sorry, the point on the design directives was to ensure the height is no more than 2 stories on Takoma. So again, they reiterate that the garden wall or garden terrace portion is 1 story, setback 160 feet. The planetarium itself is 2 stories. And then this part of the lab that presents itself on Takoma is also 2 stories, so we met that design directive. And take advantage of the topography to minimize the perceived height. This is probably the one view where you can actually appreciate it, but it is very hard to see the fact that there is 1 complete story of this building that is below ground. You enter at that level from the campus here, but as you migrate towards the west, you're completely below grade. So we're really pushing the building down significantly to reduce its presence within the neighborhood. And locating mechanical equipment and units away from Takoma Avenue. Based on the concept alternative B that we talked about tonight, we pursued that one. Most of the mechanical equipment is significantly set back from Takoma Avenue. In fact, the closest point is 250 feet from Takoma Avenue, measured 400 feet from New York Avenue, and at the center point, it would be about 350 feet to the center of that mechanical area. So I think we pushed it back as far as we can to get it out of the neighborhood as much as possible. And then maximizing the building width and lowering the height. Remember the blue trapezoidal shape we shared on the earlier diagrams? That's that shape here. You can see the black outline is the footprint of the building that we're proposing. We are really pushing the building out about as much as we can, really spreading it out as horizontally as possible to, again, minimize that perceived height of the building, to really keep it as compact and low and tucked into the topography as possible. And then just to reiterate some of the contextual relationships between the proposed design and the existing building context, here's a dimensional comparison between Science North and the proposed building with the setback straight wall. So Science North, up to its upper level mechanical screen is 48 feet. The proposed design is actually a foot shorter, so it would be lower than Science North in the mechanical screen wall, so it would be at 47 feet. And Science North is actually 40 feet as measured from grade in this sort of shared utility area between the 2 buildings. The proposed building is actually 37 feet, so slightly lower than Science North. And then looking at a very similar kind of comparison, if you look at the resource center, which is due west of the proposed site, that resource center is 39 feet tall. The portion of the building that is closest to the resource center is also 39 feet tall. So this is meant to demonstrate the fact that the building is very sensibly configured to have a very clear relationship to many of those existing building elements and to minimize any radical height variances so that it fits in as much as possible and is assimilated within the existing context as much as possible. Okay, so I'm not going to read all these words, but this is a sort of documentation of all the design directives as they were originally sort of presented to us as a challenge for this process, and then what we've done to achieve them, basically in summary of what I just went through. So this will be available for future reference if people want to understand how we've accommodated each one of these elements. All right, so now we're ready to break out.
Faster and faster each time, Bob. That's good. That's good. We're going to break out like we always do, 4 groups. Our gallery is group 1. You have it written on your name tag. Group 2 is the lobby. Group 3 will be theater up in the corner, and group 4 will be theater down here. We'll break out, we'll take questions, comments, and we'll come back together and report out. Thank you. Who wants to report out on group 1? Come on up, Molly. Are you reporting out for group 1? Come on up.
Hello, everybody. Hi. Hi. Okay, so we had some great takeaways in group 1. One of our biggest ones is if there's any way to fit more parking. We talked about other ways to bring in more natural light, because everyone loves sunlight. We talked about how Alt A was kind of top heavy, and if there was any chance like where the tanks would go and kind of equipment questions. And then we actually discussed at the Rockville campus how the learning and writing is kind of parallel to the math, and how they use that and kind of make a giant like resource center basically, and kind of the students are able to kind of go from one area to another. So we talked about how beneficial that would be if we could do something similar. And then in terms of science, we were discussing the labs and the shared maybe making a shared mobile prep lab or something like that, so that students and teachers would kind of be able to take labs from general bio and take it to kind of a higher level bio and kind of make it, you know, flowing. And then we discussed kind of how faculty, if they would take the opportunity to kind of do a day in the life of a student and walk through the building, kind of take notes of what the building has now and the changes that we can make. So even though we have the big picture in these proposed concepts, there still are little details that could be fixed, and it could be easy as just doing a building walkthrough and seeing what's changed about it. So that's all we have for group 1.
All right, I'll try to keep this brief. So first we discussed a little bit about the floor plan being designed for active learning, making sure that the office spaces are integrated so that there's more kind of organic teaching moments. We talked a little bit about the trade-off between the further recessed mechanical equipment versus solar panels. We got a couple of folks that thought that this latest round has really addressed some of the issues with the setback, both of the mechanical equipment as well as the profile of the building itself. We'll go back to this one. And then we started to talk a bit about aesthetics. Let's see, we talked about using some green and integrating some wood, some materials that are maybe easier to maintain and that would age like wine, kind of wabi-sabi. Is that right?
Yeah, you got it.
Cool. Something that's got kind of, you know, a rustic and classic look, but, you know, still modern. And then, you know, something that is not as monumental or kind of impactful as the profile of Alternative B. Then we talked about how, you know, in the following weeks, we'll kind of do some samples of the materials, and the materials will give you a much better idea of how this will look and kind of feel. Let's see, and then we also had some concerns expressed about just ensuring that some of the decisions we made here as a group over the last couple of weeks maintain beyond this process, and I think those are all valid. You know, we talked about some of those being budgetary issues and making sure that we select materials that allow us to both maintain the building from an operation standpoint and create a building that's affordable from a fiscal standpoint. And finally, we were asked about the geotechnical survey, and we know it's forthcoming soon enough. So, Jana, thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm going to report out for the wonderful group 3. A couple of things. We talked about whether either mechanical configuration option would prevent or allow for more green or solar. And the answer is really no. We can do the same amount of green or solar on either version. There was a lot of support for a green wall and also as much green roof as possible. We had a really interesting discussion about possibly trading solar for more green roof if that was more beneficial, with the caveat that green everything needs to be maintained, so we need to make sure we have the maintenance and making sure that we can get students and kind of the program involved in it as well. If solar does become part of the building, making sure we continue to look at the height of the panels that are selected so they don't add extra height that's not showing up in the designs. Making sure that we're modeling out the noise that's projected from any of the mechanical before it's selected so we know that we're managing that right. There's a really good discussion around Fenton Street and how that street is used specifically in morning and other kind of rush hour times, and how most people will probably be trying to take a left into the parking lot on Fenton Street. So what traffic and building things do we need to do to make that easier so cars don't get backed up, or so we're not forcing traffic all the way around the block for people to take a right into the Fenton Street parking lot. So it was an interesting thing to look at that. We had some discussions around making sure that we're looking at all the guidelines and standards for science buildings in residential neighborhoods, making sure that we're living up to every building standard, but also operationally looking at things like waste removal from a science and lab building. And then finally, there was, seemed like some good agreement that a good job has been done at moving the massing away from Takoma, and that this would be a far greater improvement than the existing aesthetics of Falcon Hall. So that was group 3. Group 4?
Okay, group 4. We talked about a bunch of different things, but in general, different opinions thought the mechanicals pushed back a little bit was an improvement. There was some difference in opinion there, but if we do that, hoping that the screen wall could be a little more interesting than just a screen wall, using some of the materials of the building. We all appreciated the differentiation of the massing, and so having sort of this different building broken down a little bit. And then a good point was raised about the lighting consideration, so for both aesthetic and safety purposes, to make sure that what's coming out of the building is not getting into people's homes, but also to make sure the site is well lit. And then we talked a bit about making interesting building materials, so talked about some ideas on what that could be and what that could look like, but really to keep it interesting and in character with the neighborhood. And that's pretty much a good summary.
So what we're going to continue to do, even though this is going to mandatory referral, it's not the end of the process. It is what is being submitted, and it's great to hear the feedback. This feedback will continue to be collected, will continue to be posted online, and responses will continue to be posted online. So this will keep going, but it sounds like we're in a really good spot to put something forward that's pretty exciting. And with that, I'll turn it over to Bob.
So we looked at the schedule a number of times, including a couple times tonight, but the one thing we wanted to highlight was what are we going to be talking about after mandatory referral? We alluded to this a little bit in a prior presentation, but it's really like we're hopefully centering around one building massing, building configuration on the site. We hopefully have general consensus on that. So as we move forward with the design refinement, what does that mean? So we're looking at color, facade refinement, materials. We're also going to be looking at, does it meet the budget? Are we, basically rendering the building, how it will really have its presence on its skin and how that presents to the neighborhood, and can we afford what we're talking about? So it's a good due diligence as a part of the process or anything like this. And then also we'll be talking about some construction issues. So how does the construction process impact the neighborhood? So noise, cleanliness, working hours, and neighborhood impact. There will be a construction manager hired soon, and that will be their primary focus, will be addressing those particular issues as the construction process starts. So with that, I think that's it for tonight. Oh, yeah.
I had a question. One thing that we didn't get was the at-risk, the early involvement of the construction people at risk. And I guess that just wasn't possible happening. And I'll ask you to comment on that. But I think if we had that, we would have had a little more insight into what happens when the value engineering happens and what can be put at risk in terms of some of the decisions that are being made here.
Right.
Can you speak a little bit to that process, and when will we get some idea of a contractor kind of ground truthing this financially?
So I know the process is ongoing right now. The college is actively seeking a construction manager, and RFPs out. There are many contractors that are interested. I can't say there are many high-quality contractors that are interested, so the chances are very good that we're going to get a good team. But that process is ongoing. So, we've often gone through a process like this without a contractor. Sometimes having them on board early can be a great benefit. Sometimes it can be a big distraction too, because they are sometimes fixated on their bottom line less than the success of the project and doing the right thing for the community. So it goes both ways. It isn't always like a clear benefit, but you can have it work out in either direction. I do know that as part of the mandatory referral process, when we start talking about materials, is really when that sort of cost validation part of the process is really important. And that's when, like up until now, some of the very vague design options we were showing, they could have put a price on it, but they really didn't know any of the details, so they really couldn't be specific about it, so they would be giving very broad general numbers anyway. When we really start talking about materials, then they can be very specific. And I think that's actually when they're going to be more informative to the conversation and be able to give you feedback that is really going to help make some of these decisions. So I believe they're going to be on board soon, and hopefully after mandatory referral, and as we're talking about materials, we'll be able to get feedback from them into that process.
How will the ongoing Charrette process interact with the value engineering process? Has that been planned for so that the community can be an advocate for what look to be some very nice design options?
Right. So value engineering, the question is, how is that process going to work? We have not defined that. For those of you who don't know what value engineering is, it can often be confused with cost cutting. And usually that's not what, depending on who you ask. From certain vantage points, that's really what the objective is. But really, the whole term is meant to be trying to provide the best value for the money that's available, and looking at all the things that are part of the construction project, including the finishes, the furnishings, all these different things. So we really need to put everything into a sort of scale relationship and hierarchy and say, what are the priorities of this project? Here's the funding we have available. Let's make sure that we have the funding aligned with the priorities. That's what value engineering really should be. And that's going to be the challenge of the construction manager as soon as they get on board, is to give us an assessment of what they think the value of this project is. And we will very quickly be able to say, we're either close to budget, under budget, or over budget. And if we're over budget, then it's a realignment of those priorities and for what you can achieve with your budget. So exactly when that's going to happen, sometimes it doesn't happen. If you're on budget, it doesn't happen. It's rare, but
I guess what we would like is a commitment that we'll be involved in that process, not every day for sure, but at certain critical points, so that if the priorities that the value engineers are coming up with don't align with those with what we've come up with,
we haven't really discussed that with the college to understand how that might be, how the neighborhood community might be brought into that conversation. I would think that there would be some disclosure of any of those kind of conversations, but exactly how that is going to happen, I can't say. Peter, do you have a question?
Budget.
Oh, I'm sorry.
How much is it?
What's our budget?
65 for hard construction.
$65 million for hard construction. 75.
75.
85. Are there any other questions back here?
My question is about what will be done with the feedback from the mandatory referral process.
So I can tell you that the design of a building like this takes a long time. There are a lot of details that need to get worked out. There are a lot of comments we can continue to address as we're developing the project. Just because we're going to be at mandatory referral doesn't mean we're done designing. We actually design for many months after mandatory referral. So any kind of commentary we get tonight, that we get after mandatory referral, and even during that review process, we can still incorporate that into the design as it develops. We're still at a very conceptual stage, even though what you're looking at, some of the imageries look like finished building renderings. There's still a lot behind the scenes that needs to get worked out to achieve the building that you're seeing there. So if there are specific comments that we haven't heard yet, that are going to come up later, we can attempt to address those depending upon what they are and how they relate to the
Yeah, I guess my question is there a commitment on the part of the college to pay attention to what comes out of the mandatory referral process?
I mean, I can't speak for the college in that particular part, but we can have them comment on it.
Maybe it would be helpful to have more meetings like these that can
There are additional charrettes planned in the winter, and they are conceptually going to be very similar to these.
So that was
That should
yeah.
Does anyone from the college want to address that? And then we need music next time. Jeff Rock out there.
So I think it's our hope, we have our friends from Park and Planning here, that much of what we submit tonight comes out of that process, and they validate what we've all sort of come to consensus on. That's our goal. As a general matter, we tend to listen to our regulators, and if they give us certain feedback that makes sense and is in alignment with the things that we've all discussed here, we would give it very serious consideration. More heads are better than one, as we've seen through this process. So that's, I think, where we're at. And we want what we sort of come to consensus to come under that mandatory referral process and keep moving forward.
Any other thoughts? Okay, I want to close us on a high point. I think when all of us got started, I'll put myself solidly in that, we looked at kind of what had led up to this and where we were from a trust standpoint and what needed to get done standpoint. This was going to be a challenging process. On the back end of that, I feel really good about the level of engagement. We were brought in objectively. I have no opinion on what gets built on this site. Our job was the community engagement, to make sure that we collected it was transparent, and it was used in the design process. Looking back at where we've come, I think it's been collected, it's been transparent, and I think it's definitely been used in the design process. So I feel that we've moved the process forward collectively in a really goodwill sort of way, and none of us collectively want to change that going forward. So we'll go to mandatory review, we'll come back, we'll have another discussion, and hopefully we can continue moving this project in that standpoint. But thank you all for coming out tonight. Did you have a question?
Just one thing.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say.
Absolutely.
My organization is Historic Takoma, and we are going to be talking about this project and offering feedback as well. And the thing that we're concerned about in general, you are in a late 19th century, early 20th century neighborhood. And so whatever you put here has to feel like it works in some way. The existing campus works because of the way the roof lines were designed and the buildings are small in scale. And so there's a concern that we're dealing with a very large mass, and I'm not quite sure whether it is broken up enough to give that feeling of compatibility. But the design that comes later, and certainly keeping the scale as low as possible and reducing the floor heights if possible is going to be really important for compatibility in a preservation sense, because this is it's a National Register district, and it is a local district. And so I want to register those concerns.
No, I appreciate that. And I would say, number one, the process continues, so absolutely. I'd also say that the more that groups like that want to be part of this planning process, planning works better when we do it together and not in individual rooms, so the more they can come in and make sure we hear those, that's a great process. So with that, let's end the meeting. Everyone have a wonderful night, and thank you so much for the work you've done so far. Appreciate it.
There fortunately isn't one.
Oh, yeah.